Lieutenant Colonel Lincoln Farish here, with my trusty pipe hawk. Let's talk about power. Now remember, these are my ideas, not endorsed by DoD, U.S. Army, US KPOC SWCC, or even the Kennedy School of Government. So we're going to discuss power in a social science setting, the concept of between people. And the reason you need to know this is if you understand the fundamentals of power, you can discern who has it and who does not. And then you know who you have to keep an eye on, who you have to work with, and who is able to help you achieve the commander's goals. So power in this setting is between people. It's the ability to create change in a particular way. Change not only means going one direction or another, it also is maintaining the status quo, because you're staving off entropy on that. So with no power, you basically get a downward spiral that is uncontrolled. Maintaining the status quo may not be great, but it still requires power to do so. There are essentially three types of power. You have physical, which deals with a person's safety. You have patronage, which deals with a person's lifestyle, and persuasion, which uses rhetoric to make an argument for why a person should perform a certain action or feel a certain way. Now, if you put all three of these together, physical, patronage, and persuasion, you have the greatest chance of getting the desired outcome. Physical, it's ultimately the ability to use violence to achieve a desired goal. This is through laws, regulations, and orders. Now, laws, regulations, and orders do not have as their first choice a threat of inherent violence, but they are there. If you speed, you will get a ticket. If you don't pay that ticket, someone will show up at your door and take you off to drag you in front of a judge to explain why you didn't bother to do what you were supposed to do. So essentially, physical is do it or I will hurt you. Coercion is compelling someone to perform an action, where extortion is a gain, either using your position or the threat of violence to get money from someone. So in the US, at least, legally, robbery is immediate, extortion is delayed. And all of these are types of physical power. Patronage. It's a well understood mechanism for getting and keeping people on your side through material gain. Not common in the US ever since Garfield was assassinated and we had civil service reforms, but fairly common in the rest of the world. And again, it's just the ability to affect someone's job, lifestyle, current or anticipated advancements, usually in a positive manner. Quid pro quo being the greatest example. This for that. Do this for me and I will get you the job. You will get the movie part. Stuff like that. There is also a dark side to patronage, and that is canceling, where the threat is, if you oppose us, if you work against us, if you don't support what we are saying, we will get everyone to abandon you. The third type of power is persuasion. And persuasion is just the ability to use words in a rhetorical argument to get people on your side. I'd like to say facts and logic are what do it, but people are usually swayed by emotion. Logical fallacies, invoking tradition or honor, appeal to emotion or authority. So you have a good argument and you have an effective argument. Those are not always the same. Logical versus emotional arguments. So a logical argument is based in fact and objectively true. An example would be the Army likes its members to get up early. We are in the Army. Likely, we will have to get up early. Notice the qualifier likely rather than always. However, there's a darker side of this, cold logic, which while correct, will be rejected by most. Dr. Peter Singer does this all the time. And the argument he makes is, mathematically, you can provide one guide dog for one blind American, or you could cure between 400 and 2,000 people of blindness in developing countries. Therefore, the correct choice, the better choice, is to get rid of the guide dog programs in the US and help out those blind folks in developing countries. While Dr. Singer may be correct on paper, the argument is unpersuasive, especially if argued in the US. Now, emotional arguments tend to be more persuasive, so long as any logical fallacies are not obvious. But the thing is, you have to properly target the audience, either individually or socially. That is, personal appeals try to address individual and intimate needs, and social appeal focuses on someone's position within a particular social group and or a society as a whole. A bad example of an emotional appeal would be buy a new Mini Cooper to replace your old beat-up pickup truck for the farm. Logical fallacies. The reason you want to know this is if you understand what they are and how they work, you are less likely to be swayed by them, and you'll be able to effectively counter them, or at least be more effective in countering them. So a fallacy is a fake or deceptive argument that seems irrefutable but proves nothing. And they often seem at the first blush, they seem to make sense. They seem to hold together. It's when you have to think about it that it starts to fall apart. And the problem is fallacies retain immense persuasive power even after being clearly exposed as false. And the reason for that is confirmation bias. Once we hear something that we agree with that reinforces our worldview, we are loath to disagree with it or to change our mind. Logical fallacies. I really recommend that you spend a little time learning the logical fallacies. There's a fair number of them, but they fall into similar patterns. And once you recognize them, they become very easy to recognize a bad argument. And that will help you not only in your personal life with not falling for a bad argument and knowing how to counter that bad argument. It'll also help you in civil affairs when you recognize that someone's trying to persuade people in a way that doesn't help the commander's intent. So here's a few of them that you see fairly often, at least here in the US. And you have the projection bias, and that's the concept where everyone everywhere throughout history has the same values of me. And if they don't have the same values that I hold right now this second, they're bad, and since they're bad, that makes me good. It's a way to virtue signal. You have appeal to the masses. You'll see this often with polling that's designed more to get people to go one direction or the other. And you got like 70% think the Red Sox are the best team. Okay, that's great, but that doesn't mean they're going to win the World Series. And if you poll 2 years in advance that candidate X has the most people rooting for him, that doesn't mean that they're actually going to win the nomination. But it is a way to try and get people to start thinking that maybe candidate X is in fact the best candidate. You have tone policing, and this is where someone's trying to control the argument through the emotional tone used by the person they're arguing against. It's a way to control the argument. It's judging the validity of an argument primarily on emotional tone of delivery. Got a little bit of French here, tu quoque, you do it too. And it's a whataboutism. It's trying to say our sins are much smaller than their sins, so let's ignore those and go focus on theirs. It's a way to redirect the conversation. You have begging the question. You'll see this fairly often. And it's where someone, instead of answering, tries to create doubt by begging the question. Why would anyone choose to be a bank robber? It's not like you make a lot of money. No one chooses to do that. There must be some other reason that they're doing this crime. Not really, but okay. Then you have false dichotomy, where there's choice A, there's choice B. And that's almost never true. You have guilt by association, where because you look like someone, a group of people, or you have the same last name, or you're associated in some peripheral manner with someone who is bad, you must also be bad. And you'll see this with online arguments all the time. You know who else read books? Hitler read books. He was bad, you must be bad. You're just like Hitler. You also have the perfection fallacy. And this is a combination of a bunch of them. And it's basically where I say a person or organization has to be perfect in all ways throughout history, as defined by me, or they're evil incarnate. So it's a combination of moving the goalposts, guilt by association, and a false dichotomy. We all try to persuade others throughout our life, whether it's trying to get a date, or trying to get a pay raise, or just trying to figure out where we're going to go for dinner. We all try to persuade others. But in civil affairs, there are 4 broad categories of people who most use persuasion, and that's because they're all perceived as having inherent legitimacy. So their arguments don't have to be quite as tight to get results. And that's elders, the clergy, informal leaders, and the media. And in civil affairs, make sure you're keeping an eye out on these broad categories of people so that they don't impact the commander's mission. So that's the triumvirate of power, the 3 categories of power: physical, patronage, and persuasion. And if you have all 3, your subject is most likely to perform the action that you desire. I'm going to switch topics here. I've got an OPD and I've got a little bit of historical prep where we talk about the time that Connecticut and Pennsylvania got into a war. Couple quick definitions so we're all on the same sheet of music. Total war is just that. It's an attempt to eliminate, exterminate, eradicate a people or a country. Generally considered a war crime, unacceptable, has been for a very long time. Limited war is anything less than total war, and the limits on what is acceptable have expanded over time. A just war. This was, in the West, started with St. Augustine. His defense of oneself or others could be a necessity, especially if authorized by legitimate authority. St. Thomas Aquinas followed up, and he had three conditions. One, the condition that the war was waged upon the command of a rightful sovereign, not the people. Two, there was a just cause on account of some wrong and inciting incident. And three, soldiers must have the right intent, avoiding evil and evil actions. Now, their thoughts, along with others, influenced the West all the way up through the Lieber Code, the Hague Peace Conditions, and even modern conduct on the battlefield. Now, sovereignty is just the supreme legitimate authority over a specific polity. An agent of the government is someone acting in an official capacity on behalf of a legitimate government. Right of conquest was ownership of the land after immediate possession via force of arms. This is my property, and if you say otherwise, I'm going to kill you. Now, in 1823, the Supreme Court got rid of this, at least within the U.S., and dictated that the U.S. is sovereign over all U.S. possessions, which trumped the right of occupancy. The Indians could only sell their land to the U.S. government, not to private individuals, and the Indians possess, not own the land, which gets us to possession versus ownership. So possession is I occupy the land, I can utilize the land, but I can't sell the land. Ownership is I own the land as permitted by a higher government authority. Unenforceability. So treaties are contracts, and some contracts are unenforceable. And contracts are unenforceable if there's a lack of capacity, i.e. someone's a minor or you're asking them to do something they cannot do. Coercion. If threat of force is used to make a contract happen, it becomes unenforceable. Or lastly, if there's an impossibility. Again, if I am asking people to do something that they have no ability to do, the contract becomes unenforceable. All right, let's talk about the time that Pennsylvania and Connecticut got into some combat. So you had the first Pennamite War in 1769, the second one in 1774, and the third Pennamite War in 1784. So the Wyoming Valley in Pennsylvania was claimed by Connecticut and Pennsylvania. And the Iroquois sold the land, once to Connecticut the first time, and the second time to Pennsylvania. The reason for the confusion was the King of England had handed out 3 different land charters at different times, and they seemed to overlap. And this was definitely a fight over land. Now, Pennsylvania and Maryland eventually worked out their differences and allowed the creation of Delaware by the Mason-Dixon line. And if you look at the right-hand side there, the box, Buffalo Valley, that's the area we're talking about. But if you look over on the left-hand side with that green circle, that's called the Western Reserve. It was settled by Yankees from Connecticut. If you go out to Cleveland, there's actually a college called Case Western Reserve College. Maryland got the first charter in 1632 from the English. Connecticut got theirs 4 years later. Where we run into the problem is the sea-to-sea charter of 1662. The King of England stated, "We, of our abundant grace, have given, granted, and confirmed unto the said governor of Connecticut and company all that part of our dominions in New England, bounded on the east by Narragansett Bay, on the north by the line of the Massachusetts plantation, and on the south by the sea, and in longitude from said Narragansett Bay on the east to the South Sea on the west part." Now this is a pretty bold declaration. First off, the king had basically said, Connecticut, you go from Narragansett Bay all the way to the Pacific Ocean. 2, he's saying that he owns all of the United States, or at least that northern portion of it, and can do with it as he sees fit. Kind of messed with Rhode Island because Rhode Island is more than just Narragansett Bay, and it also cut right across this territory of New Amsterdam, which the Dutch had. King didn't care about the Dutch, and 2 years later he beat them up enough that they coughed up New Amsterdam in 1664 and renamed it New York. Now, in exchange, and then you had the French out west with their territory. But again, English king said, this is mine to do with as I see fit. And so long as he had the force of arms to do it, kind of sort of, he had that ability. Now, the problem was, in exchange for the sea-to-sea charter, Connecticut was supposed to unite the colonies under a single government so that the king could easily deal with all his colonies in North America, but the Connecticut wasn't able to do it. So William Penn got a charter in 1681 of Pennsylvania, which kind of cut right through Connecticut's claims, and the Pennamite Yankee Wars were on. Eventually, it was settled by Congress at the national level under the Articles of Confederation. So the Pennamite Yankee Wars really was all about a land grab, who owned what and who was in possession of it. Like I said, it was settled by Congress under the Articles of Confederation in Pennsylvania's favor. However, in 1784, Pennsylvania tried to throw the Yankees off of their land. It caused a bit of a fervor. 1788, the Pennsylvania legislature confirmed the various land titles, and the controversy was done by 1799, with the Wyoming Valley becoming part of Pennsylvania, the Yankee settlers becoming Pennsylvanians, and legal claims to their land, and Connecticut renouncing their claim. As far as I could tell, we had 3 deaths, 1 Pennsylvania, 2 Yankees. Now we're going to contrast the Pennamite Yankee War with this vignette. So the year is 1763. The Treaty of Paris is being signed in February, ending the French-Indian War. British settlers have started to move in to occupy land formerly held by the French, to include west of the Appalachian Mountains. Pontiac, an Algonquin, French-aligned chief, calls for an uprising against the British settlers and their Indian allies, the Iroquois. And the Iroquois and the Algonquin had been traditional enemies for a very long time. Pontiac attacks Fort Pitt and Detroit, while other tribes attacked Trans-Allegheny settlers directly. One of the allied tribes of Pontiac's rebellion were the Shawnee. They were a traditional French Algonquin-aligned tribe, but had sided with the British after 1758. The Shawnee lived in autonomous towns with no central government, but in the 1760s they began appointing a ceremonial leader for diplomacy while retaining their war chiefs. In Ohio, one of these war chiefs was called Cornstalk, who led a raid into then Virginia, which the Shawnee claimed to be their hunting grounds, ending in massacres. So 3 attacks occurred. There was one at Muddy Creek, Greenbrier, and Union. These are all now in West Virginia. And approximately 200, 250, and 300 miles distant from the Shawnee home. All movement was by foot. At each attack, the only prisoners taken were women and children able to travel, and if you were slow or irritating, you were killed. The dead were scalped, anything portable was taken, the rest set on fire. No response was mounted in time to catch the Shawnee before they returned to Ohio. If we compare and contrast the Pennamite Yankee Wars with the Shawnee raid, both were over land. Now, Pennsylvania and Connecticut both had charters from the same king who claimed sovereignty over the land and allowed the settlers to own it. The Shawnee both owned and possessed land. They had sold land, they had occupied land through right of conquest, and they defended their sovereignty. But one was much more of a limited war, and one was much closer to total war. So the Shawnees' claim to the hunting grounds in Western Virginia was that de jure de facto sovereignty. Were the Shawnee even sovereign? Because in 1730, the Shawnee were part of the 6 nations of the Iroquois as a tributary. So if the Shawnee were a tribute to the Iroquois, does that mean the Iroquois were responsible for the Shawnees' actions? So were the raiders government agents? Cornstalk was a war chief. What does that make him as far as in the governance of the Shawnee? Because the Shawnee really didn't have centralized leadership as such. So would the Shawnee attack be considered a war crime? I mean, today, of course. But what about back then? So the first Lieber Code didn't even come into existence. The first U.S. Code of Conduct for the military didn't even come into existence until 1863 with the Lieber Code. Before that, a war crime was defined by the victor, or perhaps public pressure. So was the raid proportional? The inciting incident were trespassers squatting on Indian territory. Were the homesteads a legitimate military target? And lastly, did the raid make sense from the Shawnee perspective? Remember I talked about the projection bias when I was talking about logical fallacies? The projection bias is where everyone has the same values as me, no matter where they are or where they are in history. It's not true. And here's a great example where two different groups approached a problem from two different ways with two different results. Now, to give us some ideas on what was and was not acceptable, or what we consider acceptable, if you look on the one side, sovereignty had been around for about 120 years, but still had not permeated through most of the world. 1763 was 100 years before the first U.S. Code of Conduct with the Lieber Code. Before that, it's pretty much what the victor said. The first Geneva Convention happened in 1864. We were in the middle of the Civil War, so we didn't sign it until 1882. In 1907, the first Hague prescribed surprise attacks. Genocide was coined as a term in 1944 and outlawed in 1948, and ethnic cleansing wasn't even defined until the 1990s. Hope everyone enjoyed that. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me by email or the links below. So we went over power, the three types of power. Went over what a logical fallacy was and how to avoid them, to avoid being sucked into a bad argument. And then went over a vignette, doing a compare and contrast over two wars in the colonial time frame and what that meant as far as then and now. As always, a book recommendation. Learning to Eat Soup with a Knife by John Nagel. So, mostly what he goes through is he compares and contrasts the British Malaysian insurgency with the Vietnamese insurgency that the U.S. dealt with. And he maintains that a flexible organization is better adapted to handle changes, which definitely mirror what happens in a counterinsurgency. So it might be worth a good read. Go through it, think about it, see what you can pull out.